world of crypto as we know it might just be doomed. But that might be the best thing to happen to crypto since the birth of Bitcoin. I've introduced you to the dysfunctional DCG family and other characters in the orbit like Three Arrows Capital, who borrowed a lot of money from Genesis and then went bankrupt, as well as Cameron Winklevoss over at Gemini, who wrote an open letter that displayed a lot of DCG's dirty laundry, airing out those stanky linens. I laid out the plot points of how these companies have actually angered rich institutional investors as well as rich individuals and are now under assault from a few different angles. And in this episode, I'm going to crack open a complex, shadowy deal that may have been keeping DCG financially solvent, but soon could be responsible for the collapse of DCG and the collapse of Bitcoin's price, inevitably. But before I drop those big knowledge bombs on you, make sure that you smash that like button. Make sure you hit subscribe, boom, bang on that notification bell. Comment anything that you want in the relevant sections. I appreciate it. Now, let's go see what DCG's dirty linens really smell like. Episode 1 of this series explained how Grayscale's Bitcoin Trust and a regular ETF are very different. And now I'm going to explain why they are different. The distinction between Gbtc and ETFs, like the SPY, is important to understand. And by the time you click off of this video, you will understand it. ETFs, such as SPY, track a particular index or group of assets and represent small ownership stakes in each of the underlying companies. Now, the net asset value, or the NAV, of the ETF is determined by the total value of these holdings, and the share price of the ETF typically trades at a very small premium or discount to the NAV. This is because ETFs are open-ended, allowing for the easy creation or redemption of shares, which helps to keep the share price close to the NAV. Gbtc, on the other hand, is a closed-end fund. This means that the fund's issuer, Grayscale, is not able to freely create or redeem shares. Because of this, the share price of the Bitcoin fund can diverge significantly from its NAV as it has throughout its storied history. At its peak in 2017, Gbtc traded at a premium of about 130% of its NAV, which is not sustainable in the long run. This is like someone giving you $230 for a $100 bill. It's just free money if you are sophisticated enough to play the game. That's where Three Arrows Capital, or 3AC, enters the room. Investigations into the now bankrupt Three Arrows Capital revealed that they were a third party to what could be an asset co-mingling scheme at the heart of Grayscale's operations. Asset co-mingling refers to the mixing of a fiduciary's assets with their own assets. And it is technically illegal because it violates the fiduciary duty of care and loyalty that a fiduciary owes to their clients or beneficiaries. A fiduciary is required to keep the assets they are responsible for separate from their own assets in order to prevent any potential conflicts of interest or misappropriation of funds. Three Arrows Capital was essentially the only entity between Genesis straight up milking Gbtc holders for the premium in the spread between the Gbtc and the trust's NAV. But not for Genesis's benefit though. But we'll get into that later. This was the method of arbitrage that I described before that was only attainable for DCG and its subsidiaries through narrowly avoiding obvious asset commingling. But now that the Winklevoss open letter was published on Twitter, observers are likely to conclude that DCG was indeed committing asset commingling through its wholly owned subsidiaries Grayscale and Genesis by way of Three Arrows Capital. And trust me, I know it's kind of complicated to understand, so I will try to put this into as simple terms as I can manage. According to the Winklevoss open letter that was written to intimidate DCG's CEO, Barry Silbert, parent company DCG was misusing money that was being deposited into Genesis through Gemini and countless other institutional and high net worth individuals. The money that was supposed to be invested broadly in the high risk industry of crypto was actually being used as a wedge to leverage the premiums higher over the Grayscales Bitcoin Trust. Now, DCG was experiencing a large net benefit, although Genesis was technically running a very over leveraged and fragile Frankenstein lending model with Three Arrows Capital as their proxy to stuff Grayscale's trust full of real Bitcoin. In his open letter, Winklevoss even went as far as to describe the Grayscale Trust as a Thanksgiving turkey being stuffed with Bitcoin. Nice! Look, Cameron Winklevoss also claimed that Grayscale had collected more than $1 billion in fees from all of the transactions that Three Arrows Capital and others were making through Grayscale. That's a decent chunk of change. A pretty decent day at the office. It was only a matter of time before the regulators caught wind of possible criminal activity going on under DCG's umbrella. And then it started to rain. After all, regulators are on high alert with the crypto industry right now because of the level of fraud that has been exposed at FTX. Now, on January 7th, DCG's own media outlet CoinDesk reported that prosecutors from the DOJ's Eastern District of New York office had requested interviews and documents from DCG and Genesis. Uh-oh! The SEC appears to be in a similar early stage of its own inquiry into DCG as well. So, the inquiry seems specifically focused on the financial tanglings between Genesis and DCG. And I'm actually quite interested to see what that report discovers. In my opinion, the dynamic between DCG and Genesis is a classic example of the old saying, robbing Peter to pay Paul. One of the most famous cases of asset commingling that was convicted by the Department of Justice, or the DOJ, was none other than your boy, Bernie Madoff. In 2008, Madoff was arrested and charged with securities fraud after it was discovered that his investment firm, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC, had been operating a Ponzi scheme for literally decades. Thanks, Bernie. The scheme involved commingling funds from new investors with money from existing investors, giving the appearance of legitimate profits, while in reality, Madoff was using the new funds to pay returns to early investors. Sound familiar? Yeah, basically all of crypto. The scheme resulted in billions of dollars in losses for investors, and Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison in 2009. And as for Genesis, I can only assume that it will either file for bankruptcy or it will shrivel up in some other way and die. Those who have their funds stuck in Genesis will likely be fighting over the scraps for years to come. And pay attention for the next episode, where I will go over some of the possible ways out of this for DCG and Grayscale, who still have billions in real Bitcoin that they technically own and control. I have to admit, the subject is scary to cover, even for me. But I'm confident, despite the conclusions I will come to, Bitcoin will endure. But that's all I have for you for this video, and if you like this series, make sure you go watch the old videos and make sure you show up to the new ones. Obviously, make sure that you smash that like button. Make sure you hit subscribe. Boom! Bang on that notification bell. Comment anything that you want in the relevant sections. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for showing up to this video. I will see you in the next one. Have a good day, everyone.